The first time Jason Cole called me a waste of good bone structure, I almost laughed. Jason Cole, 24, Omega. My boyfriend of 3 years, top of our graduating cohort, the kind of ambitious that looks like drive from a distance and looks like fear up close. He is, for the record, not the villain of this story. He's just the reason I finally understood the difference between being loved and being useful. Not because it didn't hurt. It did, the specific way an old bruise hurts when someone presses on it just to see if you'll flinch. I flinched, once, in a life I don't like to think about. In this one, I stood very still and let the words pass through me like weather. I want to be clear that this wasn't wisdom. Wisdom is for people who read books about grief and boundaries and come out the other side enlightened. What I had was worse and better than wisdom. I had already lived this exact Friday once before down to the humidity, and I remembered exactly how badly it ended. My name is Nathaniel Ashford. Everyone who likes me calls me Nate. Everyone who's about to stop liking me calls me Mr. Ashford, usually right before they realize what that means. I'm an alpha, 24 years old, and on paper I am a junior architectural associate at a mid-size firm in Lower Manhattan, the kind of job where you spend 11 hours a day drafting other people's dreams and take the subway home smelling like graphite and cold coffee. Off paper, my last name sits on the letterhead of Ashford Global Holdings, a company my late mother built from a single commercial real estate deal into the kind of empire that quietly owns pieces of things you use every day and never think about, including, as of 18 months ago, a controlling minority stake in Meridian Dynamics, the tech giant that Jason Cole had spent our entire relationship worshipping like it was a religion with better stock options. I never told him that part. In my first life, I told myself that was integrity. Now I know it was fear wearing integrity's clothes. I wanted Jason to love the parts of me that didn't come with a boardroom attached. I wanted, more specifically, for him to believe in the guy who forgot to eat lunch because he got lost in a blueprint, not the guy whose family could buy the building the blueprint was for. He never got the chance to love that guy. He was too busy being embarrassed by him. I don't fully understand how the second life started. I've stopped trying to. One night I fell asleep in a hospital bed at 31 years old, alone, having spent the last decade of my life quietly bankrupting myself trying to win back a man who'd stopped seeing me the moment I stopped being useful to him. And the next morning I woke up 24 again, in my old dorm room at Hartwell, with graduation 7 days away and every humiliating detail of the next decade sitting in my head like a file I hadn't asked to be given. I remembered the wedding I never had. I remembered Jason's face at Derek's promotion party, laughing at a joke about me that I'd pretended not to hear because pretending was easier than admitting I'd heard it. I remembered, worst of all, the specific hollow feeling of standing in my own family's boardroom 15 years later, finally successful by every metric that mattered to strangers, and realizing there was nobody sitting beside me who'd chosen to be there before the metrics existed. I don't know what cosmic accountant decided I'd earned a second attempt. I only know I intended to spend it differently. Not colder. I want to be clear about that, because for the first few weeks I genuinely worried I'd come back as someone hard, someone who'd learned the wrong lesson from being hurt. But there's a difference between armor and accuracy. Armor keeps everyone out. Accuracy just stops you from handing your whole chest to someone who's already told you, in a dozen small ways, that they'll drop it. So this time, when Jason Cole stood outside the Hartwell Career Center in his cream blazer, with his senior's hand on a car he hadn't earned yet, I didn't reach for armor. I reached for the truth and let it be enough. Quick pause before we get into it. If this is your first time here, welcome. This is the kind of story that starts quiet and gets very, very satisfying, so if you don't want to miss where it goes, go ahead and hit subscribe now. Okay, back to the sidewalk. We were standing outside the Hartwell University Career Center on the last Friday before graduation, the sky so aggressively blue it looked photoshopped, the kind of sky New York only produces a handful of times a year, as if apologizing in advance for August. Students moved past us in loud, relieved waves, folders under arms, blazers already dark with sweat at the collar, that specific exhausted swagger of people who had survived finals and were now pretending the future had personally signed off on them. Jason stood near the stone steps with Derek Voss's hand resting on the roof of a matte black sedan, like he'd invented the concept of a car door. Derek Voss, 26, Alpha. 2 years ahead of us, already accepted into Meridian Dynamics' management trainee program with orientation starting Monday. The kind of guy who said circle back without a hint of self-awareness and wore sunglasses hooked into his collar even under a sky too bright to need them, on the off chance a camera showed up before he did. Jason wore a cream blazer over navy trousers, hair styled with the kind of precision that takes either great confidence or great anxiety, and I happened to know, from 3 years of loving him, that it was the second one. He held a leather folder with the Meridian logo embossed on the front. I had helped him practice his answers for that interview. I had, very quietly, flagged his application for a second review when it almost got lost in the volume. He thought Derek did that. I let him think it, because, in my first life, being the reason behind someone's good luck felt like enough. It wasn't. It just felt like being furniture that occasionally moved itself. Jason looked at me, then at Derek, then back at me, and arranged his face into the careful shape people use when they've rehearsed hurting you and want credit for the rehearsal. "Nate," he said, "we need to talk." In my first life, my stomach had dropped on that sentence like an elevator with the cable cut. This time, memory arrived a half-second before the feeling did, and beat it there. I already knew every line of this scene. I knew the exact tilt of his mouth when he'd say, "We're not moving in the same direction anymore." I knew Derek's laugh, dry and satisfied, like a man watching his own investment mature. I knew the silence that would follow when I tried to explain that things with my family were complicated, and I knew Jason would talk over that silence before I finished the sentence, because he'd already decided complicated meant broke. I knew he would say, "You can't even take care of yourself, Nate. How were you ever going to take care of us?" The first time, those words had cracked something open in my chest that took years to close. This time they arrived like a weather report for a storm I'd already lived through and packed an umbrella for. Jason crossed his arms. "You heard me, right?" I blinked, genuinely unsure whether he'd said anything yet or just arranged his face into pre-grief. "Say it again," I said. Derek smirked. Jason's jaw tightened, not because cruelty bothered him in the moment, but because repeating it stripped away the softness he liked to wrap around it, the little performance where he got to be the reluctant one, the reasonable one, the one who tried. "I got the Meridian offer," he said. "Official." Derek helped me finalize the paperwork this morning. "Orientation's Monday." "I know," I said. His eyebrows drew together, annoyed, I think, that I hadn't performed surprise on cue. He wanted me scrambling. He wanted his new life to feel bigger by making my lack of one look smaller by comparison. Instead, I stood there in an old canvas jacket that had definitely seen better decades, hands in my pockets, with the specific calm of a man who has already watched this exact scene end badly once, and lived to tell almost nobody about it. Derek leaned in, delighted with himself. "Big company, Ashford. Not everybody gets through that door." Jason glanced down, then back up at me, softening his voice into something he probably genuinely believed was kindness. "That's what I'm trying to say. You're always working on something, always waiting on something. Where is it, Nate? Where's your offer? Where's your future?" A few students slowed as they passed, sensing blood in the water the way Hartwell kids could smell emotional violence faster than a fire alarm. I looked at Jason and asked him the one question I never thought to ask in my first life. "What future did you think I promised you?" His mouth opened, then shut. That wasn't the question he'd rehearsed an answer for. In my first life, I'd said I have plans, just trust me, and watched him roll his eyes so hard, I was surprised he didn't sprain something. This time, I just waited. Jason gripped the folder tighter. "I thought you were serious about building a life together." "I am." "Then why does it feel like I'm the only one moving?" Derek laughed. "Because you are." Jason didn't tell him to stop. That was always the test he failed before the more obvious one. Public silence dressed up as private sympathy. Derek kept going, warming to his audience. "Meridian isn't some campus coding club, Ashford. It's one of the biggest tech companies in the country. AI infrastructure, defense-grade logistics, federal contracts. People fight for one interview." He looked me up and down, the particular disdain of a man who has decided your outfit is a referendum on your worth. Jason's here because he's ambitious, and because he finally started listening to people who understand how the world actually works. The old me, the first life me, would have defended himself right there on the sidewalk. Would have said my mother's holding company owns 11% of Meridian, and my father's on the board that approved your entire recruiting budget. Would have said it like a trump card, the way people do when they've confused being right with being loved. I said nothing. Jason mistook the silence for defeat. He always had. Nate, he said, gentler now, as though gentleness could make contempt feel less like contempt. I don't want to be cruel. Then don't be. He flinched. Derek's smile widened another degree, like he was watching a match point. I just don't think we're good for each other anymore, Jason said. I need someone who understands where I'm going. You mean Derek. He looked away, and that was answer enough. He helped me, Jason said. No, he didn't. Derek's head snapped toward me. Careful. Jason's face went cold in that particular way. That means this is exactly what I mean. You can't even admit someone else did something good for me. You always act like you're quietly important, but there's never any proof. Quietly important. In my first life, I had spent 3 years being quietly important to that man. Quietly proofreading his cover letters at 2 a.m. Quietly redirecting recruiters who'd never heard of Hartwell's tiny architecture program. Quietly absorbing the credit he gave to louder men for the foundations I'd poured underneath him. He never noticed the floor. He only ever noticed who was standing on top of it with him. You think I have no proof, I said. I think if you did, you'd have shown it by now. That sentence was more honest than he realized. He respected display. He had never once, in 3 years, respected substance he had to go looking for. Derek stepped closer, enjoying every second of this. Jason doesn't need another dreamer holding him back. He needs someone who can actually walk him through the front door of a place like Meridian. I did that, I said quietly. No, Derek said. He did. He nodded at himself in case anyone had missed who he was. But here's the thing about Second Lives. Nothing had been finalized yet. Because that morning, before I ever walked onto this sidewalk, I had already called Oliver. Oliver Hale, 41 Beta. My family's executive fixer for as long as I can remember. The man who once rerouted a hurricane evacuation plan for 11 buildings before breakfast, and still had time to remind me to eat something with protein in it. If Ashford Global Holdings had a nervous system, Oliver was most of the wiring. Cancel every informal push connected to Jason Cole's file, I'd told him. Let him pass or fail on his own merit. No thumb on the scale in either direction. Understood, he'd texted back. Removing personal sponsorship, independent HR review will determine placement. Fair warning. Expect a downgrade if no direct sponsor remains attached to his file. Jason still had a real offer. His grades were real. His interview skills, which I'd spent months coaching, were real. He wasn't stupid. He was polished, socially fluent, excellent at presenting work when someone else had quietly helped structure it. But the strategic track rotation he thought he'd earned, the one that had been mine to give as a courtesy, and not, apparently, a love language he wanted to acknowledge, that was gone now, not out of spite, out of accuracy. Jason stepped toward me, and for a second something like uncertainty crossed his face. I don't want to humiliate you, he said. That's generous of you. His cheeks colored. I mean it. No. You mean you don't want to witness the humiliation? There's a difference. Derek's smile faltered slightly. Jason looked genuinely hurt, which was almost impressive, given the circumstances. I'm trying to be kind. Kind would have been ending this before you brought him here to watch. He glanced at Derek, who looked amused, and Jason clearly did not enjoy being amusing in that context. Derek's my mentor. No, I said. He's your excuse. Something flashed in his eyes. The particular anger of a person who's been caught telling a comfortable lie. That's the insecurity I've been talking about, Nate. In my first life, I'd have fallen straight into that trap. I'd have explained, at length, how mentorship didn't usually involve late dinners and expensive rides and mockery delivered with an audience. By the end of the conversation, I would have sounded jealous, small, exactly the man he was describing to justify leaving. This time, I just nodded. Maybe, I said. Jason blinked. He'd expected defense. I gave him agreement instead, and it landed harder than any argument could have. Maybe I am insecure, I said. Maybe I'm useless. Maybe I couldn't get through Meridian's lobby with a security escort and a personal invitation. Derek laughed. At least he's self-aware. Jason looked uncomfortable now, like the scene had gone off script and he didn't know his next line. So go, I said. His expression shifted. What? If Derek's your future, go be in it. I'm not going to stand on a sidewalk and audition for a role I already know I lost. He stared at me like I'd switched languages mid-sentence. In my first life, I begged. I said, "Don't do this. You know me. You know what we have. I promised to prove myself," and he had laughed, softly, almost fondly, the worst kind, and walked to Derek's car without looking back once. This time I just held his gaze and said, "Good luck, Jason." The words landed with the specific weight of a door closing somewhere he couldn't see yet. His face moved through confusion, then irritation, then something close to fear. "You're not going to say anything else. You already left," I said. "I'm just not following you this time." Derek opened the passenger door with a flourish that would have worked better on someone who hadn't just watched me not beg. "Come on, babe. Orientation prep lunch. Don't waste the reservation." Jason hesitated. That half-second hesitation might have destroyed me once. Now I recognized it for exactly what it was. Not love, not doubt, just a man checking whether the safety net was still stretched out under the window before he jumped. It wasn't. Not anymore. I'd rolled it up myself weeks ago, in a life he didn't know I remembered. I hope you figure things out," Jason said, softer now, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I have," I said. He got into the car. Derek shut the door for him and looked at me over the roof. Sunglasses finally deployed now that the sun had, in fact, come out. "If you ever make it past Meridian's lobby, ask for me at the desk. I might be able to get you a visitor badge. I'll remember you said that," I told him, and meant it in a way he wouldn't understand for another 72 hours. He laughed, got in, and drove off. Jason looked back through the passenger window once. I didn't wave. And that's when the second car pulled up. It arrived the way certain people arrive in your life. Not loudly, not with sirens, just with a kind of gravitational certainty, like the street had been rearranging itself to make room for it the whole time. A long black car, the paint so dark it looked wet even in direct sun, slid to the curb exactly where Derek's had been 30 seconds earlier, as though claiming the spot on principle. The driver's door opened first. A man in a charcoal suit stepped out, said nothing, and simply opened the rear door. And then Gabriel Cross unfolded himself out of the car like he had all the time in the world, and had decided to spend some of it on me. Gabriel Cross, 29, Alpha. If you read the business section, you knew him as the reclusive head of Cross Enterprises. Real estate, private security, logistics, a portfolio broad enough that nobody asked too many questions about how a man that young controlled that much of lower Manhattan's skyline. If you read anything else, the tabloids, the true crime forums, the whispered stories that never quite made it to print because nobody who repeated them out loud stayed comfortable for long, you knew him by a different name. The Cross family. The kind of organization people in this city didn't investigate so much as respectfully avoid. I knew him as the guy who used to help me sneak out of Ashford family fundraisers through the kitchen when I was 17 and he was 22, and already, somehow, the most dangerous person in every room he walked into without raising his voice once. He wore black like it was a professional obligation, dark hair pushed back like he hadn't quite finished getting ready and didn't care, and an expression that made the handful of remaining students on the sidewalk instinctively lower their voices, the way you do near something you can't name but recognize as bigger than you. "Nate," he said, like we were mid-conversation and he was simply picking the thread back up. "Sorry I'm late." I felt my whole ribcage unclench, which was inconvenient, because I hadn't consciously known it was clenched. "You're not late," I said. "You're suspiciously well-timed." "I have excellent timing," he said, gaze flicking, unhurried, toward the taillights of Derek's car disappearing around the corner. "It's a professional skill. A few students who'd lingered to watch my breakup now openly gawked at the second, far more expensive act." Somewhere behind me I heard someone whisper, "Is that the Cross guy in the tone people usually reserve for weather events?" "You didn't have to come," I said, quieter now, just for him. "I know," Gabriel said. "I wanted to see your face when it was over instead of hearing about it secondhand from Oliver's very dry incident report." He studied me for a second, the kind of look that felt like it was checking structural integrity rather than admiring the view. "You're not shaking? Should I be?" "Last time," he said, and didn't finish the sentence, because he didn't have to. He'd been the one who picked up the pieces the first time this life happened. Except, of course, he hadn't, because in the timeline where I lost everything, Gabriel Cross and I had never gotten close enough for him to be the one picking up anything. That was a different failure, a quieter one. The one where I loved a man who never got the chance to know me because I was too busy trying to be loved by someone who never asked the right questions. I didn't remember explaining any of that to him in this life. And yet here he was, showing up outside a career center like he'd been dispatched by some cosmic HR department that specialized in second chances. "You look like you're doing math in your head," Gabriel said. "I'm doing math in my head. Get in the car, Nate. I'll buy you something that costs more than your dignity currently feels like it's worth, and you can tell me whether I need to have a professional conversation with the sedan that just left." "You are not having a professional conversation with Derek Voss." I said conversation. "You said professional." I only agreed to the second word. Despite everything, the sidewalk, the folder with the wrong logo on it, the sentence about my bone structure still hanging faintly in the August air like humidity, I laughed. Real laughter, the kind that surprises you on its way out. Gabriel's mouth curved, satisfied, like he'd been aiming for exactly that reaction the entire time and had simply been too polite to admit it. "There he is," he said quietly, and held the car door open. I got in. It wasn't a decision so much as a gravitational fact. My apartment that night smelled like garlic and impending intervention before I even got my key in the door, which meant Theo had already let himself in. Theo Bennett, 24, beta, my best friend since our first week at Hartwell, currently an EMT, which meant he had officially witnessed more human catastrophe in a single shift than most people see in a lifetime, and had therefore developed the specific, terrifying calm of a man who treats a breakup with the same triage energy as a broken femur. He was standing at my stove in scrubs he clearly hadn't changed out of, stirring something that smelled better than my life currently looked, and he had a printed list taped to my refrigerator like an eviction notice. I dropped face first onto the couch instead of helping, because I had decided, somewhere between the elevator and my front door, that I had used up my entire allotment of adulting for the day and intended to spend the rest of the evening as a decorative cushion. "What," I said into a couch cushion, "is that?" He held up a wooden spoon like a gavel. "Post-breakup big tech humiliation prevention plan. It has 7 points. You made a bulleted list. I made a numbered list, Nate. This is not amateur hour." He gestured at the fridge with the spoon. 1. Do not text Jason. 2. Do not correct Derek Voss in public. 3. Do not restore any sponsorship you pulled just because Jason looks sad about it on a story. 4. Do not say the words, "Maybe he doesn't know what he did." 5. He knows. 6. Oliver handles all files. You handle dinner. 7. Nathaniel Ashford eats a meal like a functioning mammal at least once today. Functioning mammal, I repeated. I wanted urgency with biological weight. You need help. You need dumplings, he said, and set a plate in front of me before I could argue, which was, frankly, the correct order of operations. While we ate, my phone lit up 3 times in a row. Jason, posting. A photo outside the Meridian Tower downtown, taken from across the plaza since neither of them had actually gone inside yet. A close-up of 2 champagne flutes, with Derek's watch conspicuously visible at the edge of the frame. And finally, a quote graphic white serif text on a soft gradient. "Sometimes growth means leaving behind the people who can't grow with you." Theo nearly choked on a dumpling. "Absolutely not. I need to comment. Just once. A single misdemeanor? No. A civil infraction, then. Something small. No, Theo." He groaned and put his head down on the table dramatically enough to disturb the soy sauce. "You're taking the high road so aggressively, it's honestly a little concerning." "I'm not taking the high road. I'm taking the documented road. Oliver has infected you with his vocabulary. Maybe he had." My phone buzzed again, this time an actual call, not a notification. Oliver. Nate. He'd worked for my father before me, which meant he still sometimes talked to me like a status report instead of a person, but I'd stopped minding that years ago. Jason Cole's placement finalized after the independent review. He retains his offer, no sponsorship attached. Placement is operations associate, onboarding cohort B, standard 6-month review, no executive mentor pairing. Theo, listening shamelessly with his head still on the table, whispered, "From the golden elevator straight to the stairs." "Derek Voss remains a probationary management trainee," Oliver continued. "No hiring authority, no influence over placement decisions. He appears to believe otherwise. Does Jason know that yet? Unclear. His onboarding profile wouldn't show internal sponsorship history." Which meant Derek had probably already convinced himself he'd personally opened the door, and Jason had probably already convinced himself the same thing, because that story let him keep the version of events where leaving me was ambition instead of what it actually was. People generally choose whichever version of reality lets them keep looking like the hero of it the longest. Do we need to intervene further? Oliver asked. No, I said. Let the normal process work. Good, Theo said to the ceiling. There it is again, the holy word. Oliver wisely ignored him. Orientation begins Monday, 8:30 a.m. Your keynote is at 9. Board introduction at 9:15. Don't tell them in advance, I said. A pause, the sound of a man who has learned not to ask why. Understood, sir. After he hung up, Theo looked at me for a long moment, all the humor draining out of his face into something more careful. You okay? No. Clear-headed, though? Yes. Good, he said, and went back to eating, because that's what real friendship looks like sometimes. Someone who lets you say no and yes to two different questions in the same breath and doesn't make you explain the gap between them. My phone buzzed one more time. Jason. For half a second, every nerve in my body remembered the first life. Jason after he'd humiliated me. Jason after Derek had ignored him for a week. Jason reappearing exactly when he needed an essay edited or a recommendation letter drafted. Love arriving strictly on an as-needed basis. I hope you're not angry, the message read. I know today was hard. Someday you'll understand I had to choose a real future. Then, a second later, you're a good person, Nate. I just need more than good. Different sentence, same grave. Theo took the phone gently out of my hand, read it, and his expression lost every trace of humor at once. Do you want me to? No, I said. I want you to finish your dumplings and tell me something stupid that happened on shift today. He studied me a second longer, decided I meant it, and launched into a story about a man who'd called 911 because he'd glued his own hand to a bowling ball, and somewhere in the middle of it, laughing for the second time that day, I thought, impossible things are for first lives. Second lives require execution. I dressed for Monday morning in a suit Oliver's assistant had sent over. Nothing flashy, perfectly fitted, the specific quiet that expensive things achieve once they stop trying to prove anything. I put on my mother's watch, the one my father had worn for a decade after she died, and given to me the day I turned 18, not as wealth, but as continuity, a small metal reminder that some things outlast the people who love them. Gabriel called at 7:15, which I noted, because Gabriel Cross did not accidentally call anyone before 8. You're up early, I said. I have excellent timing. We've established this. Are you coming? Do you want me there? I thought about it honestly, which surprised us both. No, not for this part. Good answer, he said, and I could hear the smile in it. I enjoy watching you stand exactly where you belong without asking anyone's permission first. That sentence stayed with me the entire elevator ride down. You sound proud of me, I said. I am. Don't let it go to your head. I still fully intend to have that professional conversation with Derek Voss eventually. Gabriel, a conversation, Nate. I'm a businessman. We're allowed to have conversations. You're not a businessman, you're a roomer with a tax ID. An excellent tax ID, he said, entirely unbothered, and hung up before I could argue further, which was, I was learning, one of his favorite tactics. Meridian Dynamics rose out of the financial district like a glass blade catching the early light, 40 stories of blue-black reflective panels, employees streaming through the security gates with badges and coffee, and the fast, tired walk of people whose calendars had already started attacking them. Jason and Derek stood near the lobby entrance with a cluster of new hires. Not inside yet, outside where the photos were better. Jason wore a cream blouse-style shirt and navy trousers, and the specific tension of someone trying to make operations associate sound like a strategic career choice he'd selected on purpose. Derek stood beside him, laughing too loudly with two other trainees, sunglasses back on despite the overcast sky, apparently on permanent standby. He saw me get out of the car first. His smile widened into something almost gleeful. Unbelievable, he said, loud enough for the group. You actually came, Jason turned. His face did something complicated. Nate. Derek walked toward me, hands spread. Here for a tour? Lobby's technically open to the public. I looked past him at the Meridian sign, then back. Something like that. Jason stepped closer, and I could hear the old life trying to repeat itself in his voice. Why are you here? I could have answered with everything. Instead, I said orientation. Derek laughed, delighted. Orientation for what? Building maintenance? A few of the new hires chuckled uneasily. Jason didn't. Something in the way I wasn't reacting had already started bothering him before Derek had finished the joke. The glass doors opened, and Meridian's chief people officer, Grace Whitfield, stepped out with 2 security staff and an assistant carrying a tablet like it contained the nuclear codes. "Mr. Ashford," she said warmly. "Good morning. We're ready for you upstairs before the keynote." The group went dead silent. Derek's smile evaporated so fast it was almost audible. Jason stared at me like the sidewalk had opened underneath him. Grace turned to the new hires with a practiced smile. "Good morning, everyone. Registrations through the main lobby. Please have your IDs ready." Then to me gently, "Board entrance is this way, sir." Board entrance. 2 words, and the whole morning cracked open around them. I walked past Jason and Derek toward the executive gate. I heard Jason whisper, "Mr. Ashford?" behind me, like the 2 words didn't fit together in any sentence he'd ever prepared for. I didn't look back. Not because I didn't want to, because I finally understood the difference between wanting to and needing to. The auditorium held 600 people, and on orientation morning, roughly 300 carefully hidden anxieties along with them. New hires filled the lower section by cohort, engineering looking suspicious of the whole enterprise, business trainees networking with the oxygen in the room, operations hires organized into tidy, patient rows. Jason sat in the 5th row with operations, not front and center, not strategic. 5th row, aisle seat, gripping his folder like it might still change its mind about him. Derek sat 2 sections over with probationary management trainees, checking his phone, then the stage, then Jason, then his phone again. Whatever confidence he'd walked in with hadn't survived the lobby. I watched from the wings. Oliver stood beside me with a tablet. "You're on after the CEO's welcome," he said. "I know you revised the remarks 3 times. Version 3's the best. You mean the least emotional. I mean the most useful." That was, apparently, the correct answer, because he actually smiled. Meridian CEO, Charles Whitman, late 50s, sharp-eyed, the kind of steady operator who'd spent 8 years making the company efficient enough for Ashford Global to keep increasing its stake, welcomed the room, congratulated the new hires, warned them that intelligence without discipline was an expensive habit, and then paused in a way that made the whole auditorium lean in without quite realizing it. "This year," he said, "Meridian begins a major structural transition. As many of you know, Ashford Global Holdings is our largest strategic shareholder and long-term partner. Today we're honored to introduce our incoming Director of Strategic Systems and Board Representative for the Ashford Family Office." Phones lowered, heads turned toward the wings. "Please welcome Mr. Nathaniel Ashford." I stepped into the light. It was brighter than I expected, not blinding, clarifying, the way good light makes everything easier to see rather than harder. I saw Jason's face go white, hands frozen mid-clap. I saw Derek's mouth open and nothing come out. Several new hires turning to look at him, clearly remembering his lobby comments from 15 minutes earlier. Good. Not because I wanted a spectacle, because accuracy deserved witnesses. I shook Charles Whitman's hand and stood at the podium for a moment before speaking, letting the first life rise and settle in me one last time. Jason laughing outside the Career Center, Derek's ask for me at the desk, the message that said I just need more than good, and then I let all of it go because it belonged to a version of me who was no longer available. "Good morning," I said. "Welcome to Meridian Dynamics." My voice didn't shake. Titles matter because responsibility matters. But a title is never the first measure of a person. How you treat people before you know their title tells us more about your judgment than anything on your resume. Jason looked down at his hands. Derek stared at me with something curdling into hatred behind the shock. "Meridian builds systems people rely on when mistakes get expensive," I continued. "That means we don't reward arrogance dressed up as confidence. We don't reward people who mistake someone else's silence for weakness. And we don't reward anyone who assumes a quiet colleague is beneath them just because their influence isn't advertised on a business card." The room went silent, a good silence, the kind where you can tell some people are listening and a few are quietly sweating. "You're here because Meridian saw potential in you," I said. "Staying here will require proof, not social proof, not borrowed influence, not who you arrived with. Your work, your judgment. How you hold up under pressure nobody's watching." My eyes passed over the 5th row. I didn't stop on Jason. That would have been too easy, and I'd stopped needing easy a while ago. I finished the remarks, stepped down to applause that started at the executive row and rolled backward the way it always does, because new employees clap for power before they understand what it means. And I walked off stage into a hallway that smelled like fresh paint and other people's futures being decided in real time. Derek found me during the mid-morning break, which took approximately 11 minutes longer than I'd have guessed. He caught up to me near the executive elevators, alone this time, sunglasses finally, mercifully, tucked away. "Mr. Ashford," he said, testing the syllables like they might taste different now that he knew what they cost. "I owe you an apology. I had no idea." "You didn't ask," I said. "There's a difference. Fair." He smiled, recalibrating fast, the way people do when they realize the game changed and decide the smartest move is to change with it. "Look, I'd genuinely love to grab coffee sometime. Get your read on the strategic roadmap. I think I could bring a lot to that work, if you're open to it." I studied him for a second. His very sudden interest in my read on anything, his eyes doing the specific math men like Derek do when they realize proximity to power is the only currency they've actually earned. He wasn't asking for coffee. He was applying for a promotion using flattery instead of a resume, and doing it with the kind of confidence that assumed I hadn't watched him build his entire personality out of exactly this move for the past 2 years. "I'm going to pass," I said. His smile flickered. "It's just coffee, Nate, Mr. Ashford." "It's never just coffee with you," I said, not unkindly, just accurately. "You don't want to know me. You want to know someone who can get you into a room. I already watched you decide I wasn't worth your time from a sidewalk outside a career center. I'm not interested in the sequel where I suddenly come worth it because of an org chart." Derek's jaw tightened, the mask slipping just enough to show the annoyance underneath. "You could use someone who understands ambition. I've met plenty of ambitious people," I said. "You're the first one who thought ambition was a personality instead of a starting point." He didn't have a comeback for that. I watched him reach for one anyway, the way people do when silence feels like losing, and come up with nothing but a tighter jaw and a glance toward the elevators, as if help might arrive from that direction. "I already do," I said, and Gabriel Cross's name arrived in my head so easily, so completely, that I almost said it out loud right then, weeks before I'd technically admitted it to anyone including myself. "I'm not going to find him in you." I left him standing by the elevators, doing the math on a return he was never going to get, and went to find somewhere quiet enough to breathe. Gabriel found me first. He always did. I stepped out onto the executive terrace on the 14th floor, a strip of Meridian real estate technically reserved for board members that I'd discovered during a facilities tour 2 months earlier and immediately claimed as mine. And he was already there, leaning against the railing in a suit that had absolutely no business looking that good at 10 in the morning, city noise rising faintly from 30 stories down. "You're not supposed to be here," I said. "I'm on the board," he said. "Technically, you're on the board of a shell company that owns 8% of the parking structure, which," he said, "is technically Meridian real estate. My lawyer's very thorough." I laughed, the sound loosening something in my chest that had been tight since the lobby, and dropped in specific, boneless relief of a man who has decided the rest of the day can simply wait its turn. He watched me the way he always did, not staring, exactly, more like reading a document he already knew he liked, but was checking for edits. "How'd it go?" he asked. Derek asked me to coffee approximately 6 minutes after learning my last name. I could have him fired. "You cannot fire people at companies you don't run, Gabriel. I could make it very difficult for him to get a good table at restaurants for the rest of his natural life," he offered. That's within my jurisdiction. That's insane." "It's efficient," he said, echoing Oliver so precisely I actually snorted, and he looked entirely too pleased with himself for causing that reaction. We stood there a moment, the city doing its ordinary miraculous thing below us, and something in me decided that I'd been dancing around a sentence for long enough. "You showed up outside the career center," I said. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." "Why?" He turned to face me fully, and for once there was nothing performative in his expression, none of the careful, amused distance he wore like armor around everyone else in his life. "Because I've spent about 6 years watching you let people who never earned it decide what you were worth," he said. "And I got tired of waiting for you to notice. there was someone standing right next to you the entire time who already knew the answer. The city kept going below us, oblivious, the way it always does when something enormous happens to exactly two people at once. That's a very dramatic thing to say on a parking structure balcony, I said, because apparently my instinct in the face of overwhelming feeling is to make a joke, which Theo would say explains an alarming amount about my personality. I own 8% of this parking structure, Gabriel said. I'll be as dramatic as I like on it. I stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth off him, the particular scent that had started meaning safe to me somewhere in the last year without my permission. Say the actual sentence, Gabriel. His mouth curved, and for once there was no armor at all behind it. I love you, Nate. I have for longer than either of us is going to be comfortable admitting at brunch someday. I'm not asking you to feel the same thing on my schedule. I just wasn't going to let you walk out of that career center thinking nobody had noticed you. I kissed him. Not dramatically, not like a movie, just simply, the way you finally set down something heavy you didn't realize you'd been carrying, his hand coming up to my jaw, careful, like I might change my mind, which, for the record, I did not. Somewhere behind us, a Meridian facilities worker cleared his throat loudly and pretended to check a fire extinguisher he had clearly not come up here to check. We're causing a scene, I murmured against Gabriel's mouth. I own 8% of the scene, he said. It's fine. Word travels fast in a building full of people trained to notice everything. By lunch, half the new hire cohort had somehow learned that the man who'd just delivered a keynote about integrity and judgment was, apparently, involved with a man tabloids referred to as New York's most dangerous eligible bachelor, which was, frankly, a fair assessment, even if it left out that he also remembered how I took my coffee and had once spent 40 minutes on the phone talking a stray cat off my fire escape ledge because he refused to let me climb out after it myself. Jason found me near the cafeteria, alone, holding a tray of food he clearly had no intention of eating. A brief, quiet update for anyone keeping track. Jason Cole, still 24, still Omega, no longer wearing the specific armor of a man performing certainty for an audience. Congratulations, he said, and it actually sounded genuine, which surprised us both. On all of it, thank you. He hesitated. I didn't know. I know you didn't. Would it have mattered? He asked, and there was something raw in the question, like he already suspected the answer and needed to hear it out loud anyway. I thought about it honestly, because he deserved that much, even now. Maybe if you'd asked instead of assumed. But you didn't need my name to know I was worth staying for, Jason. You needed proof you could show other people. That's not the same thing as love. That's a receipt. He flinched, but didn't argue, which told me more than any apology could have. Derek doesn't know you well enough to know that yet, I added, but you will. Someday, hopefully before it costs you as much as it cost me. He nodded, eyes wet, and didn't try to hide it, which felt like the first honest thing he'd done in front of me in a long time. I'm sorry, he said. I know, I said. So am I, not for leaving, for letting you leave without ever knowing what you were actually walking away from. I walked away first, this time. It felt less like closing a door and more like finally, gently, setting one down. Dating Gabriel Cross, it turns out, comes with a very specific learning curve, most of which involves discovering exactly how many restaurants in Manhattan will clear an entire private room on 20 minutes' notice, and exactly none of which involves him ever explaining why. You just texted someone the word now, I said, watching him pocket his phone at the end of our first actual dinner together. Not the balcony, not a crisis, an honest-to-God scheduled date, candles and everything, which felt almost absurdly domestic for a man who, as far as I could tell, negotiated with people by making them regret being born. That's it, just now. It was an efficient message. It was ominous. I contain multitudes, he said, which I would later learn was his answer to roughly 40% of my questions, delivered with the exact same unbothered calm whether the subject was dessert or, apparently, felony intimidation. He walked me home that night the long way, past the harbor, hands in his coat pockets, matching his pace to mine without either of us mentioning it, the city doing its usual thing of being loud in the distance and strangely quiet right where we were standing. When we reached my building, he didn't try to come up. He just stood there a moment, studying me the way he always did, like he was checking a structure for weak points and finding, to his evident satisfaction, none. "Good night, Nate," he said, and kissed my forehead instead of my mouth, which somehow undid me more thoroughly than anything else he'd done all night. "That's it?" I asked, mock offended. "No dramatic proclamation? No parking structure percentages? I'm pacing myself," he said. "I have decades to be dramatic at you. I'd like to enjoy the slow version first." I thought about that sentence for 3 days afterward, which was, I suspect, exactly his intention. Theo met Gabriel officially 2 weeks later, over brunch, at a restaurant Gabriel had absolutely not cleared out in advance, mostly because I'd made him promise beforehand under threat of eating alone. "So," Theo said, folding his hands on the table with the specific gravity of a man conducting a formal inquiry, "you're the rumor with the tax ID." "An excellent tax ID," Gabriel said, entirely unbothered, and Theo looked at me like I'd personally engineered this exact exchange for his benefit, which, in fairness, I sort of had. "I have a list," Theo told him, producing from an actual folder an actual printed list. "It's for Nate's protection. There are rules." "I'd expect nothing less," Gabriel said, and leaned forward with genuine interest, which I hadn't anticipated, and which threw Theo so completely off his prepared script that he had to glance at me for backup. "Rule 1, Theo read, recovering admirably. "If you make him cry, it better be from happiness or I will find you, and I know things about hospital security protocols that should concern you." "Noted," Gabriel said. "Rule 2, he forgets to eat when he's stressed. If you notice he hasn't eaten in 6 hours, that's an emergency, not a personality trait." "Already tracking that one," Gabriel said, and I felt an unreasonable amount of warmth spread through my chest at the fact that it was true. He'd started leaving small containers of food in my office at the firm weeks before either of us had said the word boyfriend out loud, always with a note that said nothing more dramatic than "eat this" in handwriting so precise it looked typed. Theo studied him for a long moment, something in his expression softening past the performance. "You actually care about the boring parts," he said, sounding almost surprised. "Most people who show up with a car like that only care about the exciting ones. The boring parts are the ones that matter," Gabriel said simply. "Anyone can be dramatic for an afternoon. I'm interested in the version of this where I'm still doing the boring, correct thing in 30 years. Rule 3, Theo continued, undeterred, flipping the page with the solemnity of a man reading a will. "If you ever need to disappear a body, I am a mandatory reporter and cannot legally assist, but I will absolutely help you pick out a very convincing alibi." "Theo," I said. "It's called being prepared, Nate." Gabriel, to his enormous credit, didn't laugh, didn't blink, just nodded like this was a completely standard clause in a completely standard document. "Noted," he said again. "For the record, I don't believe in messes I can't clean up myself." "That's somehow worse," Theo said, delighted despite himself, and folded the list back into its folder like he'd gotten exactly the answer he'd been hoping for the whole time. Theo looked at me over Gabriel's shoulder and mouthed, silently, "Keep him," which I fully intended to do regardless of anyone's approval, but it was nice to have it anyway. Meeting my father went, against every prediction I'd privately made, better than meeting Theo. William Ashford had spent 30 years learning to read people across a boardroom table, which meant he spent most of dinner not talking, just watching. The way Gabriel pulled my chair out without making a production of it, the way he'd already learned I hated cilantro and quietly asked the waiter to leave it off my plate before I could, the way, when my father asked a pointed question about the more complicated aspects of cross-enterprises, Gabriel didn't flinch, didn't deflect, just answered honestly and let the silence after it sit exactly as long as it needed to. "I won't pretend to be something I'm not for your comfort, sir," Gabriel said, "but I will tell you that everything dangerous about me has always been aimed at people who deserved it, and never once at your son." My father was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My wife used to say the measure of a man wasn't what he was capable of. It was what he chose not to do with it." "She sounds like she was right about most things," Gabriel said. "She generally was," my father said, and something in his shoulders eased that I hadn't realized was tense until it wasn't anymore. Dessert arrived, and with it, a brief and entirely unnecessary standoff over the check, which Gabriel won by the simple expedient of having apparently paid the restaurant in advance, a move my father found so audacious he actually laughed out loud. A real laugh, rusty from underuse, the kind I hadn't heard since before the funeral. "You didn't have to do that," I told Gabriel afterward. "I know," he said. "I wanted to see if your father would threaten to have me investigated for it." "Did he?" He asked which firm handled my books. That's the polite version of a threat for men like your father. Later, walking me to the car, my father squeezed my shoulder once, briefly, the closest thing to an embrace he'd offered since the funeral. He watches you like you're the only structurally sound thing in the room, he said. Don't let him talk you out of believing that's rare. I didn't. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count since. We fell into a rhythm neither of us announced out loud. Tuesday dinners that were sometimes his terrible attempts at cooking and sometimes takeout eaten straight from the containers on my apartment floor because neither of us could be bothered to find plates. Sunday mornings where he'd show up unannounced with coffee and the specific, quiet request that I show him whatever building I was currently obsessing over, listening with real attention while I explained load-bearing walls and sight lines to a man who could probably have bought the block and demolished it by lunch if he'd wanted to, but never once made me feel like the explaining was small. He never once asked me to be less careful, less quiet, less exactly the version of myself that Jason had once called a waste of good bone structure. If anything, he seemed personally offended on my behalf every time the memory came up, which it did, occasionally, in the specific unguarded moments right before sleep. I could still have that conversation with him, Gabriel offered once, half joking, half not, tracing slow circles against my shoulder in the dark. You are not having a conversation with my ex-boyfriend. A very reasonable conversation. Gabriel. Fine, he said entirely too easily, which meant he'd already decided something and simply going to tell me what, and I decided, wisely, to let that be a problem for future Nate. What I noticed, slowly over those months, was how much quieter the old wound got every time Gabriel chose, again, to stay. Not loudly. Not with proclamations, mostly, those he saved, deliberately, for parking structure balconies and other equally absurd venues. Just consistently. Tuesday after Tuesday, Sunday after Sunday, 100 small, unremarkable choices stacking up into something that finally felt like proof I didn't have to go looking for. By the time the leaves turned that year, Ashford Global's Public Systems Initiative launched under Meridian's banner. Logistics infrastructure for emergency response networks, unglamorous, essential, the kind of project that saves people time in ways they'll never notice or thank anyone for. Jason applied, eventually, to a training track that let operations hires move into technical strategy through documented performance, rather than borrowed sponsorship. He didn't ask me for help. Good. He wasn't accepted the first round. Also good. His manager told him exactly what to fix, and he fixed it, and reapplied, and earned a lateral move 6 months later that I heard about secondhand, through Grace Whitfield, through Oliver, the way you hear about a life that stopped needing you to narrate it. Derek Voss attempted 2 startups in the following year, both loud, neither durable. His name occasionally surfaced on professional networking posts about disruption and leaving toxic corporate culture behind, which Theo, delighted, kept a folder of screenshots titled Derek Discovers Verbs. I told him to delete it. He said he did. He was lying. I know because he still occasionally texts me a new edition at 2 a.m, usually captioned for the archive, like we're running some kind of joint federal investigation into a man's LinkedIn presence. Gabriel, for his part, never did get his professional conversation with Derek. He claims this was restraint. Theo and I maintain, with matching amounts of confidence, that Derek simply stopped getting invited to industry events. Gabriel's people were quietly involved in planning, which is either an enormous coincidence or the single most polite act of sabotage in New York's tech scene that year. Gabriel refuses to confirm or deny this. He just smiles the way he does when he's already won an argument and doesn't feel like collecting the prize out loud. I ran into Jason once more before the year was out, in the elevator lobby of Meridian's 14th floor, both of us there for entirely unrelated reasons. Me for a board briefing, him carrying a stack of onboarding binders for a training session he was now, apparently, helping run. "You look good," he said, and it landed differently than it would have a year earlier, plain and unweighted, the way you'd say it to someone you used to know rather than someone you were still measuring yourself against. "So do you," I said, and meant it. He did, steadier somehow, less like a man performing certainty for an invisible audience, and more like someone who'd finally stopped auditioning for his own life. "I heard you got married," he said. "I did. To the..." He hesitated, visibly deciding how to phrase it. The Cross Enterprises guy. Gabriel, I said. Yes. He nodded slowly, something almost wistful crossing his face, though not, I noticed with some relief, anything close to regret. He seems like he actually sees you, Jason said. I used to think I did. I don't think I ever really looked long enough to. No, I agreed, gently. You didn't. I'm not saying that to get anything from you, he added quickly. I think about it sometimes. What I would have found if I'd stayed and actually paid attention instead of being scared of falling behind everyone else. He shifted the binders in his arms. I'm good, though. Genuinely. This job, the real version of it, the one I actually earned, it taught me more than the version I thought I wanted. I'm glad, I said, and I was. The elevator arrived. Neither of us moved to get in first. For what it's worth, Jason said. I hope he burns dinner sometimes, and you still think it's funny instead of a red flag. I laughed, surprised into it. He does. I do. Good, Jason said, and there was something almost like peace in the word. That's how you know. We didn't hug. We didn't need to. He got into the elevator with his binders, and I stood there a moment longer, watching the doors close on the last piece of a story I no longer needed to keep retelling myself. And then I went to find Gabriel, because I'd promised him lunch, and because some habits, the good ones, are worth keeping no matter how many lives you get. As for me, I stayed on at the architecture firm for another year before finally letting my name mean what it had always meant, taking the board seat that had been waiting for me since before I was born, and somehow still finding time to argue with Gabriel about whether owning 8% of a parking structure legally entitled him to make dramatic proclamations on it. It did not. He made them anyway. There is a specific chaos that happens when a man who runs a legitimate real estate empire and an entirely illegitimate everything else empire decides, at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, that he is going to learn how to cook risotto because his husband made an offhand comment about missing his mother's version of it. You're supposed to stir it constantly, I said from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, watching Gabriel Cross, a man who had, to my personal knowledge, once negotiated a shipping dispute in 4 languages without raising his voice, stare down a pot of rice like it had personally wronged him. I am stirring it constantly. You checked your phone twice in the last 90 seconds. That was business. Gabriel. It was a very time-sensitive text about a warehouse. We don't own a warehouse. I don't own a warehouse, he corrected, stirring with renewed, suspicious vigor. That's a different sentence. I laughed, the sound easy now, in a way it had taken me most of a year to fully believe in, and crossed the kitchen to steal a piece of Parmesan directly off the cutting board, which earned me a look of profound betrayal. That was for the risotto. I'm quality testing the ingredients. It's a service. You're a menace. You married the menace. I had, in fact, married the menace 4 months prior, in a ceremony small enough that Theo had cried through the entire thing and loud enough about it that his own patients had apparently asked him, the following week, if he was doing okay. Oliver had given a toast that was somehow both the driest and most sincere thing I had ever heard a human being say out loud, ending with, Nate, I've watched you build things your whole life. I'm glad you finally built something that stayed built. My father had cried and denied it. Jason had sent a card, no note, just a card, which was, from him, the most emotionally mature gesture I'd ever received, and I meant that sincerely. We weren't having children, and honestly, between Gabriel's schedule of quietly terrifying important people into behaving and my own of quietly convincing city planning boards to let architecture do something interesting for once, our household was already operating at full, chaotic, deeply happy capacity. One husband, one deeply judgmental cat who had in fact come down off that fire escape eventually and never left, and, apparently, one ongoing risotto emergency. It's burning, I said. It's caramelizing, Gabriel. It is on fire. That's a strong word for what's happening in this pot. I turned off the burner myself, laughing too hard to argue further, and Gabriel pulled me in against his chest anyway, risotto catastrophe and all, resting his chin on top of my head, with the specific, settled contentment of a man who had once told me, on a parking structure balcony, that he'd spent years watching people fail to notice what I was worth. For the record, he murmured into my hair, I would burn every kitchen in this apartment for you and consider it a professional success. That's the least reassuring thing anyone has ever said to me. I refuse to lose an argument to a vegetable. It's rice, Gabriel. I refuse to lose an argument to a grain. Order takeout, he said finally, entirely without shame, already reaching for his phone. I'll tell Oliver it was a warehouse thing. I let him think he'd gotten away with it, mostly because watching Gabriel Cross, feared, precise, terrifyingly competent Gabriel Cross, lose a fight against a pot of rice was, without question, one of my favorite things I had ever witnessed. Somewhere between plating the takeout and losing an argument about whether chopsticks counted as trying, Theo called. Video, uninvited, the way he always did. Is that risotto I smell through the phone, he said, squinting at the screen. Or is that the smell of defeat? It's the smell of defeat, Gabriel said, entirely unbothered, holding the phone up so Theo could see the pot in question, which had by then achieved a color not typically found in nature. I have never been prouder of anyone in my life, Theo said. Nate, marry him again. Do it twice. We're working on dinner, Theo. You are working on a warehouse fire, Theo said, delighted, and hung up before either of us could argue, which was, we agreed, extremely on brand. Later, curled up on the couch with actual takeout, and the judgmental cat wedged pointedly between us like a chaperone, Gabriel pulled up something on his phone and turned it toward me without a word. It was a photo from Meridian's public systems groundbreaking, 6 months back, me in a hard hat I clearly hadn't wanted to wear, mid-law at something off-camera, and behind me barely in frame, Gabriel watching me instead of the podium, wearing an expression so unguarded it didn't look like the man tabloids were afraid of at all. Grace Whitfield sent it to me, he said. Said I should have it printed. I told her I already had 40 better ones. You have 40 photos of me? I have considerably more than 40, he said, entirely without shame, setting the phone down and pulling me in against his side instead, chin resting against my hair the way it always did, like he was checking, out of habit now more than worry, that I was still exactly where he'd left me. I told you, I've been paying attention for a very long time. That's either the most romantic or most alarming thing you've ever said to me. Both, he said. I contain multitudes. Outside, the city kept doing its ordinary miraculous thing, the same way it had the morning I stood on a sidewalk outside a career center and let a door close on a life that was never going to fit me. I thought sometimes about that Nate, the one from the version of this story that never got a second chance, the one who spent a decade quietly proving his worth to a man who'd already decided not to see it. I hoped, wherever that version of things had gone, he'd found his own way out eventually. I liked to think he had. I didn't need to wonder anymore, though, not really. I had my answer sitting right next to me, arguing that a burnt pot of risotto counted as a learning experience rather than a disaster, refusing on principle to admit defeat to a vegetable. Some men mock you outside a career center and call it honesty. Some men show up uninvited in a black car and call it timing. I'd learned, the hard way and then the right way, that the difference between the two men was never about who arrived louder. It was about who stayed, through the boring Tuesdays, the burnt dinners, the version of me that had nothing to offer but himself, long before there was a boardroom, a title, or a story anyone would ever bother repeating at brunch. Gabriel Cross stayed. That was the whole story, really. Everything else was just the scenery, and that's the story. If you liked watching Nate go from furniture that occasionally moved itself to a man who finally got chosen properly, do me a favor and subscribe. I've got more like this coming, and you really don't want to scroll past the next one by accident. See you in the next story.